So this section ties back to what we talked about in the chapter on light. So it turns out that elements actually generate light. So we can actually see this if we have a special instrument called a spectroscope. So you can actually see this person using one. The way these guys work is that the light enters a slit at one end. So you can see that here. This is just white light that's coming in. And that travels through the tube through what we call a diffraction grating. So this is going to split the light. So we can see it kind of like a prism when we talked about rainbows in the previous chapter. And then that spreads the frequencies out across our eyes. So the atomic spectrum is the pattern of frequencies that an individual element is going to create when viewed with a spectroscope. So when we view just plain white light with the spectroscope, we're going to see all the different frequencies. And that makes sense because we're seeing white light, which, as we know from our previous chapters, that white light contains all the frequencies of light. But when we ignite elements, that actually excites the electrons inside of those elements and gets them to release frequencies. And so that's what we're seeing here. Here are what we call flame tests with different elements. So we've got strontium, potassium, barium, and copper. And these are the results of viewing them through a spectroscope. And so you can see we don't get the full spectrum. We don't get from red all the way down to violet. Instead, we get these discrete little bands of light in specific areas. So you can see strontium has lots of bands compared to, say, potassium. And it's concentrated here in the blue, a little bit in this yellow-green area, and then more bands in this red-orange area. And so the flame that we see is kind of the red with a little bit of purple in it. Versus potassium, which potassium has more of the blue, green, and yellow, which makes the flame appear blue. So these different elements are going to show these different spectra. So you might be thinking, so what? Why do we care? Well, this is actually how scientists have been able to figure out what distant stars and planets are actually composed of, based on viewing the atomic spectra that our telescopes are able to see. And so we've been able to figure out what kind of elements are in distant stars and on possibly distant planets to help us determine maybe if there's a possibility of life and so forth on those distant planets, and what kinds of stars are out there, because we know that different types of stars are going to interact with their planets and systems differently. So how is this light being generated? Because, you know, everybody kind of figured, okay, so we can see these frequencies of light, but what is causing them? And so the Bohr model is the first attempt to explain why this is happening. So it's explaining the formation of these atomic spectra, these light frequency lines, based on this idea. So the potential energy of an electron depends on its distance from the nucleus. So remember, potential energy, that's that stored energy that we find in objects. And it turns out electrons have potential energy too. Just like if you have a ball and you raise it up, it has more potential energy. Same thing with an electron. The farther you pull it away from the nucleus, the more potential energy it has. So higher energy, the farther away it is from the nucleus. The other thing that this model is going to work with is that when a photon or a packet of light is absorbed by an atom, the atom gains energy. Because remember, photons, light energy is energy. And just like we talked about when objects are going to interact with light, Some of that light is reflected, but some of it is absorbed, and that increases the thermal energy on objects, like when we wear dark colored clothing. Well, the same sort of thing is going to happen when photons are absorbed by atoms, because those atoms are going to absorb that energy. Just instead of turning it into thermal energy, it's going to turn it into energy, potential energy and kinetic energy for the atom. And so the lower energy electrons are going to get boosted to higher potential energies. So that's what that energy is going to go towards, is pushing those electrons from close at the nucleus to farther out from the nucleus. It gets them more excited and energized. Then it's going to eventually give that energy off. Electrons can't hold that energy forever. It's too stressful, if you want to think of it that way. If you think about like the batteries video from the electricity, electrons don't like high stress jobs. So they're going to let go of that energy eventually. And so it's going to give off that energy and drop back down to its low stress job, its low stress level. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So here we've got our low energy, low stress electron, and it gets hit by a photon. So it gets hit by a packet of light. When that happens, it gets energized and gets pushed away from the nucleus. So it jumps up to this higher level. Eventually, it's going to give that energy away because it's too high stress. It doesn't want to stay there. So it gives the energy away, drops back down to its low stress job, and then when it lets that energy out, it lets it out as a photon again, as light energy. So why is it different colors? Why do we get those different bands, the green, the orange, the blue? Well, it turns out it depends on where the electron starts and where the electron falls to. So you can see here, if we have an electron that falls from the third level to the second level, it's going to let off a specific frequency. If we have an electron that falls from the second level to the first level, it's going to give off a different frequency. And then we'll get a third frequency if we have an electron that falls from the third level to the first level. Because they're each going to have different amounts of energy to release. Because, for example, this guy is farther away, and so he's going to have a little more energy to give up when he drops than this guy will be, because he's not as far away. This one is going to have a lot more energy, so it's going to be a higher frequency because he's got a lot farther to fall. Okay. So this is what the Bohr model looks like. So electrons have what we call discrete levels of energy, meaning that it's like steps. They can only go from one level to the next. We call this the principal quantum number, or n. So that's why they have all these little n's here. And so electrons can't go a half step, just like we can't go a half step when we go up steps. Okay, so it can't be in the middle here. So you can't have n 2.5. It's either 2 or 3, no in between. But the problem with this model is it doesn't explain this behavior. It only states it goes from N1 to N2 and then drops back down and gives off the energy to create the atomic spectra. So another group of scientists worked to figure out why. Why is this happening? Why can electrons only make it to these specific steps? Why aren't they in between somewhere? And so what they came up with is the electron waves theory. And this explains why electrons are restricted to a particular energy level. So let's see if I can get the video.
It's on the wave model of an electron. Remember, as we look at the level of an electron, we see that they don't behave like particles, but act more like waves. And it was this wave model that allowed us to really understand what was going on at this classical level of a Bohr atom. And so we realized that electrons could be here or here or here, but they didn't exist in the middle, and that was puzzling to scientists. Also, why is it when an electron falls down, it emits a photon of light, this certain amount of energy? Well, the wave model unlocked that because we've really got a good understanding of how waves work. So if we have waves moving back and forth, they create something called a standing wave. And so what scientists started to hypothesize is maybe the electrons, as they're moving around, are interfering with themselves. They're going so fast that they're interfering with the electrons as they come around again. And so maybe they're wrapping around and creating standing waves. And so areas out here, we could get a standing wave where the electron moving around the outside of the atom is interfering with the electron itself. And so what you get are these standing waves that build up, and that's where that energy allows the electron to be there. But in between these different orbits, they don't match up perfectly. And so they have to be a whole integer of the wavelength, the de Broglie wavelength, for the electron to exist. If it doesn't match up perfectly, then the electron annihilates itself. And so electrons can only exist in certain energy states. And so the wave model allows us to understand this at the level of standing waves. And so standing waves occur when the waves are interfering with themselves. And so the de Broglie wavelength showed us what that wavelength is, and then we could use that to calculate the momentum and even figure out what's the size of the atom itself. Another important thing it showed us is that as electrons fall to a lower energy level, that energy contained within that standing wave is released in the form of a photon that we can see in these spectral lines. So to really understand what's going on with these wave electrons is we could think about fundamentals and harmonics. And so when you strum a guitar, this would be the first fundamental. This would be the second fundamental, the third fundamental. So using that as a model, if we're looking at electrons, they're moving out from the center with different wavelengths as well. And so let's start with the first inner electron. What's really going on is one wavelength is wrapping around the atom itself. What would that look like if we look here at this first orbital? It's going to look like that. Now we know something about the momentum of the electron. We can calculate the de Broglie wavelength, and if we plug it into this equation, this here is just the circumference of that circle, we can figure out what's the size of the atom, and it ends up matching up with the Bohr radius that we'd measured before, 0.53 angstroms. Now what is the next level going to look like? Well, we have to have two wavelengths in there. So what's that going to look like? It looks like that. And if we go to 3 wavelengths, we're going to have a different de Broglie wavelength. And so what are we going to get? It's going to wrap around like that. And so what's happening is the electrons are racing around, interfering with themselves. They're building up energy in that one energy level. Now, what's interesting about that is as they fall back down, they release that energy in the form of a photon. How do they jump back up to a higher level? They have to absorb that photon. And that starts to explain why we see these spectral lines. And so
all right. So he talked about wavelengths, the de Broglie wavelengths. Don't worry about that. What I wanted you to be able to see was his animations that show what these pictures are showing, which is the fact that these guys are doing what we talked about in the waves chapter, which is that constructive and destructive interference. So that's what they figured out that these electrons are doing. They are constructively interfering with themselves to build up these levels versus destructively interfering with themselves, which is what he was showing you here, where they don't actually overlap correctly and, like he said, can actually destroy themselves. So what does that do? Well, it allowed us to build and finalize a model called the shell model. It's similar to the Bohr model because it has those restricted levels, and it also includes this wave nature. So it has those waves like we just saw in the video. And the shell is the region of space around the nucleus where the electrons reside. So you can see here it's now a 3D model. So the electrons can build up those waves in any part, in any direction of that 3D circle or radius. The shells are concentric, so they start in the center with shell 1, 2, 3, 4, and they get bigger as they go out, as they build up those different wavelengths. And we know those are at least 7 shells, and each can only hold a specific number of electrons. This seems to be tied to them interfering. So if you get too many of them in a shell, they seem to interfere with each other due to those wave natures, and you can't have more than a specific number in a single shell. So how many can be in each shell? So here are the models. Now, a lot of times we actually will now draw them as the Bohr model with those rings, because this is kind of hard to visualize and work with. So you'll commonly see atoms actually drawn like this with the Bohr model, and you can see the numbers there. So shell 1 is the one closest. It would be labeled N1. It can only hold a maximum of 2 electrons before they seem to interfere with each other. And then shells 2 and 3, as you can see, can hold 8. Shells 4 and 5 can hold 18. And shells 6 and 7 can hold 32. So we'll see that this actually ties to the periodic table, which is what the next video is going to pick up with.